Hello everyone. Today we are looking at kind of an introduction to women in art, somewhat looking at really the origins and reasons why women have largely been excluded from the greats, if you will, and the art world in many cases of that recognition. And how that's developed over time, and kind of gives us that background as we then move into examining where women have played a role in art, right? So I think it's important to first examine and look at why it is not common to learn a lot about women in art before we then dive into doing so. So with that in mind, here are the kind of the topics that we are going to be looking at in this lecture. So we got looking at Jackson Pollock and Janet Sobel. Why have there been no great women artists by Linda Nochlin? Women's roles in the domestic sphere, the guild system, masters and apprentices, and then the changing role of women through the 20th century. Because obviously, as we move into more modern times, some of the traditional barriers that existed in the earlier periods have diminished to a degree. One of the things that is very clear is that women are still underrepresented in the art world, both in name and recognition, as well as commissions and overall pricing and gallery options for women. So there's still a significant barrier for women today in the art world, but it definitely has improved the opportunities for women. In fact, women make up 70% of art schools. So in terms of education, there's been a drastic swing towards accessibility and opportunity. But what hasn't translated from that is opportunity afterwards. And it also depends, of course, on the direction that you go with that. There are certain opportunities that are more available than some of the kind of what is seen as classical or traditional art, such as fine art, painting, drawing, sculptures, are a much harder area to break into for women than, let's say, animation or digital art with companies specifically, rather than as the individual artist. So that there is one of the larger disparities is actually in the individual artist and, promoting in art galleries and things like that. So that is what we're looking at today. And so let's start with looking at a good example of how women have been displaced, overshadowed, taken advantage of by men, intentionally and not intentionally, unintentionally. It goes both ways, but the kind of story of Jackson Pollock and Janet Sobel is a good, I think, example of this. There are several others. There's some where it's actually husband and wife, and where the wife's paintings actually inspired the husband, and the husband is the one that got the notoriety and recognition, even though the wife was the one that had initially been the painter and inspiration. But in this case, I think Jackson Pollock and Janet Sobel is a good example of that. So Jackson Pollock is most people know his name. Life and Time magazine claimed that in both of those magazines, they had proclaimed that he invented drip painting, which you can see, let me get that on here with a pen, an example right here of drip painting. And they claimed that with his invention of drip painting, bringing in American abstract expressionism. So, he was given this idea of expressionism as or abstract expressionism, that he is kind of the founder of the American movement because of his drip paintings. His very first drip painting, which drip painting is the technique of splattering and dripping paint kind of on the fly, approaching the canvas from all angles. Often the canvas is put on the floor. So up until this point, traditional kind of painting was that canvases were on easels, and that you kind of planned out and approached it from almost kind of straight on. And so drip painting was seen as this, somewhat renegade or rebel style of painting to disregard those traditional structures and instead have it on the floor. And of course, it was about the messiness and randomness of how paint ended up on the canvas itself as you moved around the canvas, as you use different techniques to splatter and drip the paint, rather than the kind of measured brush strokes of traditional painting. And his first drip painting was a piece titled Galaxy, from 1947. And it certainly makes a good story with this, right? And I have it here, that he was often portrayed as this macho, hard-drinking cowboy that decided to rebel against the traditional methods of painting that were, that they kind of marked as this, stifling old school painting. And here we have this American, cowboy man that is coming in the late 1940s, 1950s, and is a rebel to those traditional ways and throwing off the confines of the classical style for new pathways, and certainly was seen as a trailblazer, which was also a very common motif for men in general in the 1940s and 1950s. There was this idealized sense of men as trailblazers in various fields, not just art. So that whole story fit nicely with this motif that was already going around, and his artwork. And of course, one of the things is that Jackson Pollock did make drip painting famous. There's no denying that he brought it to the forefront for a wider audience to be aware of, but he was not the first. He did not invent drip painting, and in fact was influenced by a female artist, Janet Sobel, who actually started doing drip painting before he did. So she was born in a Jewish settlement in Ukraine. Her father was killed in a program which is essentially a state-sponsored mass killing of a specific group of people, in this case, the Jewish populations in Ukraine. Because of this, the rest of the family moved to the United States in 1908. So she had a kind of, and this is, I think, something that is very often commonly traditional of women, is that she didn't have the traditional, I guess I used the word there twice, but the traditional route to her art. And also I think is also something that is very common with women, and we could put this here, beginning of career, right? That often women are not just an artist, but a mother and a wife, right? That's seen as the homemaker, right? And then also, is a painter. Or some kind of other artist, a sculptor and whatnot, right? She didn't have an art education or formal training. And how she started is that her son actually was an artist. And her son had earned a scholarship to the Art Students League, but he had decided he didn't want to attend. And she was disappointed in this and had tried to convince him to change his mind and to go. And so he ended up telling her, if you're so interested in art, why don't you paint? And ended up giving her his paint supplies. And so she ended up doing just that. She started experimenting and painting with her son's art supplies that he was no longer interested in using. She didn't actually start with drip painting. Those were not her first paintings. But one of the things that was common with her paintings is that from the start, she tended to paint on the floor, even before the drip paintings and things like that. And because, and some could argue that this kind of creation of something new came about because she wasn't constrained by a formal education that shaped her view of what art should be. As she began painting and trying out different styles and techniques, she ultimately came to experiment and try out drip painting by simply saying, what if I just start squirting paint directly onto the canvas out of the paint tube, right? And she tried a variety of techniques, right? Squirting paint using a vacuum cleaner hose to basically pull the wet paint across the canvas. She tried dripping paint with an eyedropper. And of course, the canvas was on the floor like her other types of artwork, which allowed her to approach the canvas from all angles and put paint and splatter paint and drip paint from different directions, which is definitely part of that, is that it isn't all just coming from the center aspect of the painting of the canvas. And this then certainly is some of the art. Like, she had other art that was displayed that Jackson Pollock is going to notice. Her first drip painting was the Milky Way in 1945. And even notice the naming, right? Milky Way, 1945. And if we go back, Jackson Pollock's was titled The Galaxy in 1947. So even the title of that space theme in the naming convention of it, he hers was named the Milky Way. He then named his first drip painting the Galaxy. There's clearly a direct connection to her work, and even the way that he named his first drip painting in that process. So this was 2 years before Jackson Pollock's drip painting. And so her son ended up becoming one of her biggest supporters and cheerleaders, which is often one of the things that women do struggle with in the art world. Again, one of those things of when we look at Why Are There No Great Women Artists by Nauckland, is that some of it is simply a lack of access to the galleries and art sphere and connections and networking that allows your artwork to get promoted and recognized, which will then generate the interest and then the name recognition. Her son was, again, a huge supporter of her work and recognized her talent and ended up promoting her work to Sidney Janis, who had been the advisor to the Museum of Modern Art, and ended up including her in an expedition that toured the United States. It was called Abstract and Surrealist Painting in America. And so this is a big step with this and whatnot, because being able to get that connection with Sidney Janis and then being displayed in exhibitions that toured the United States, it put her paintings out there. It created some name recognition, and this led to additional support. In fact, her biggest supporter was Peggy Guggenheim. who was a well-known figure in the art world, specifically in New York. And she ends up including her work in an exhibition called The Woman, and also continued to support Sobel in her own show in 1946. So she had supporters that helped promote and push her into art galleries and touring ones, which are important because, again, just even getting a gallery is a big thing. But if you are in a touring gallery, that's going to create a whole new level of exposure, especially pre-internet, right? There's a whole different kind of level within art and marketing with the internet and the prevalence of the internet now. But obviously this is prior to the internet. So to be on a touring exhibition is a huge thing that gets your name out there, not just in one region. And then, of course, her location was important. The fact that she was in New York, which was kind of the center of the art world, was also significant in that. And certainly, like when we talk again, going back to Nochlin, some of just becoming a great and a well-known figure has to do with not just only access and opportunity and support, but also location, right? If you're in some rural random area where there's not much of an art scene and you don't have a way to have your art be passed to other locations, you're less likely to get noticed than someone who is living in the center of the art world and can have an opportunity to have their artwork shown in a gallery that is famous for making artist or well-known artwork, right? There's just a huge difference in access and availability just from that. Anyway, so what ends up happening is Pollock and his friend visit the gallery, the exhibition that featured Janet Sobel's drip paintings. That was one of Peggy Guggenheim's exhibition, and Pollock admired Sobel's work, describing it as strangely pleasing. And in fact, what's interesting with this is that later, as there were a biography was being done on Pollock, the friend that went with him at the time shared the kind of interaction with Janet Sobel's drip painting, which both at once recognizes her direct influence on his creation of drip painting. Again, not even creation, but almost imitation of drip painting, and marginalizes her in the exact same sentence. So I'm going to read you this quote. It says, his friend who was with him stated that he and Pollock noticed one or two curious paintings shown at Peggy Guggenheim's by a primitive painter, Janet Sobel, who was and still is a housewife living in Brooklyn. Pollock and I myself admired these pictures rather furtively. The effect, and it was the first really all-over one that I had ever seen, was strangely pleasing. Later on, Pollock admitted that these pictures had made an impression on him. Okay, so again, in this quote for Pollock's biography, his friend admits that her work influenced, not only was he drawn to it, that he called it strangely, which even calling it something strangely pleasing, I suppose it could just be because it was so different. But someone has that kind of view of like, oh, well, this is weird art, but surprisingly pleasing kind of thing. But if we just say it's strangely pleasing because it was so different from the kind of traditional artwork, it's clear cut that even he says that that Pollock admitted that these pictures made an impression on him, so much so that he goes and creates his own drip painting that he had not done before and titles it with a space theme the same way her Milky Way that was on display had been titled. Like, clearly he took inspiration very much directly from Janet Sobel. But at the same time, this quote is so dismissive and somewhat misogynistic in its structure. First, they completely marginalize her art. And the same quote that says Pollock was inspired and influenced by her, he also marginalizes her as well. He calls her work, he calls her a primitive artist, right? So you have this idea that she is somehow less than and simplistic, which, you know, is rich, coming from the fact that his drip paintings, if we can go back and look, here's Pollock's, here's one from Janet Sobel. There's obviously differences, and yet clearly a lot of similarities as well. One is no more primitive than the other, and yet it's being her as an artist, she's being described as this primitive artist, and of course this dismissive, still a housewife, right? So what is this? And this actually goes again to Nochlin and stuff, this idea that she's less than because she's an artist, but also a housewife, right? And if she's still a housewife, then she clearly hasn't made it as an artist. It's looking down at her for not being a full-time professional artist. Oh gosh, she's still a housewife, you know. So clearly her artwork is primitive at best because she's still a housewife. So it's a crazy quote in that sense of like almost, you know, definitely attributing and slightly praising and putting down at the same time, and completely dismissing her as an artist in the process. So of course then what ended up happens is Pollock later adopts this style of drip painting, which then he becomes famous for, and then and not just famous, but right, then is incorrectly claimed to have created, and then been this most important influence in American abstract expressionism, which he was, but again under the kind of falsity that he had created drip painting, when in fact he had really, don't want to claim stolen, but certainly taken very liberally from a woman who had done it first, but simply because of situation, name recognition, and access, and of course because as her role as a wife and mother, she had other obligations besides just being a painter. She's going to fall into obscurity while Pollock is going to rise in recognition and fame in that process. And again, as I mentioned, he did make drip painting famous, but he didn't invent it, right? Clearly, he was influenced directly by her work from this visit to this art gallery and this specific exhibition that took place, even though, that he didn't just come up with it on his own. And this is just one example of the many ways that women have been present in the art world throughout history and have been dismissed, have been copied and pushed aside. And this is common in history and in various topics for Black men and women throughout history. You see this where in music, in inventions, in art, where they are the first to create or produce something that then is copied with slight adaptations by a white male who brings it into the forefront of society and makes that style or invention or whatever famous, and they become famous for that creation of it without the attribution to who really first developed it, right? And so that is something that is very common, and in a more ancient period of history, there were cases where women took on pseudonyms, male pseudonyms, because they weren't going to be recognized as a female artist, so they painted under a male name. But what it does, of course, is it erases then their actual identity connect to that artist, especially the further back you go, where we have less records and ability to always identify the true story behind it, right? This is a more modern story. And so we're able to identify that and whatnot. So here's a picture of Janet painting on the floor. You can actually see some of her other types of styles of artwork besides the drip painting, and that had always been a style to be on the floor painting. So how did you have kind of the coinciding of Pollock's rise with Sobel's decline? And part of that is because she was married and women had other obligations. They moved to rural New Jersey for her husband's career, and this created difficulty with visiting New York, which again is where you needed to be to influence and put forth your art as the kind of center of the art world, right? So this idea of location as important to recognition. And then she ended up developing some kind of allergy to some of the paint ingredients from the paint that she used. And so she ended up switching mediums rather than searching out other types of paint. There's way more paint availability now than there was even in the 40s and 50s. She could have found other types of paints, but it probably would have been expensive. And it was easier just to shift to a different medium that didn't inflame this allergy that she ended up having. But ultimately, when you move away from paint, the whole drip painting style is not going to be reproduced if you're not using paint. And then she did lose support from Peggy Guggenheim, not because she stopped liking her work, but simply that she moved to Europe. So that influence and direct support and connection to art galleries in New York also disappeared in the process. And so her work stopped being featured in exhibitions around the same time that Pollock's rise in fame and recognition increased, right? Because he had the benefit of being able to focus his career and all attention on the production of art, unlike the other obligations that Janet had chose and probably had to, with some societal expectations, to follow. Again, so I like this. I wanted to kind of feature this to just show that some of what we know about in the art world in terms of women's roles, and this is that she had, although relatively unknown, a significant impact on the art world. If you're going to claim that Pollock it was directly responsible for the creation and move towards American abstract expressionism, right? So they're saying Pollock is, right? Well, then you have to say that also Janet Sobel also was as well through Pollock, right? And that we should be recognizing her in that creation, not just Jackson Pollock, especially with how closely she clearly was influenced and utilized her style to create his, right? He didn't create drip painting. He copied that concept from her. He titled his work the same kind of space theme as her. And so that while she may not be directly the person who ushered in American abstract expressionism, she did through her influence of Jackson Pollock, right? And that is something that is part of the role of women in art, is not just that, you know, trying to find out, you know, different female artists that were well known, but that there are plenty of cases of women directly influencing and inspiring male artists who get the recognition, who make something famous, and that they should also be included in this history of their contribution, albeit indirectly, directly and indirectly, directly to Pollock, indirectly through the larger scale of the public, and that is something that this isn't a one-off, right? This story is not a one-off of that. Okay, so the next thing I'm looking at is the article, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists by Linda Nochlin. And so I'll bring that up here in just a minute. But I do want to just give a kind of a general overview. So she explores the absence of women in our history, of course, with the question of, you know, in the title here, you know, is this question gets asked, but she's even going to challenge the question itself and say that is in itself problematic. So we'll look at that, but she explores the absence of women in art history and what does it really mean, and also the claim that women lack talent, because what she's going to argue with this is that this question alone, what it actually suggests is that women are not as talented as men in the art world, although she goes to look at the larger aspect of it as well too. And so she said this is part of the problem with this question, is right, people ask this question and one of the things that people want to do is just directly go into saying, well, what about this artist? What about this artist? And that's fine, but it's kind of falling into the trap of the question, in which the question itself has an inherent issue, which is this question is suggesting that women are lacking in talent compared to men, and that is not the case, that women are not part of the greats in the sense of ability, right? But that there is specific exclusions within societal expectations, what is available in terms of professional opportunities, education, and general social structures of the time. And all of that has actually, that basically society and the structure creates a systematic we'll say what problem? A systematic whole structure that I already wrote structure, so I'm saying it twice, but a systematic denial, that's probably the better word for it, of female artists. So, right, it's actually society and the social systems and structures that have prevented female artists, not just a lack of women being interested in art or having the talent for it. So let's actually take a look at that here. Okay, so this is the article that I had you guys look at and read. So I'm going to kind of go through. I marked it up so it just for time to kind of go through some of the key aspects. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to skip around to the kind of key points that I pulled out from the article. Just due to time, obviously, I'm not going to read it. It would be tedious if I was reading the whole thing to you. But what I found that I think are kind of the key things for it. So one of the things that she mentions right here near the start is this idea of, in the field of art history, the white Western male viewpoint unconsciously accepted as the viewpoint or the viewpoint of the art historian. may and does prove to be inadequate, not merely on moral and ethical grounds or because it's elitist, but on a purely intellectual one. She says it's revealing the failure of much of academic art history and a great deal of history in general. Because, of course, what it's setting up is that art, and then she expands to say, and other history in general, which is true, history as well, has been shaped through the white male viewpoint. And, of course, specifically, the white male victor's viewpoint, right? Those who have conquered and come out ahead are the ones who write the histories, or at least the ones that then are used and promoted and passed down. And that in that same way, art has been shaped through this specific lens. And because of that, right, you're already starting off with this question from this lens of how art has been shaped through the lens of a white combination of middle class and upper class men. And therefore, you're already going to, there's going to be a predisposition to not include women as part of those greats in the same way that men are, because it's coming through that specific lens in society, specifically a Western male, white male viewpoint in that process. So, of course, that's largely going to focus on Western white men and their roles within the art world over even other non-white men that are artists as well. That right? So there's already going to be a bias towards that, let alone even a higher bias towards than women in that field, and what is going to be written about, what is going to be displayed, what opportunities are going to be available. All of that is then shaping that, right? And that, which is what I said here, right? This shapes the view of the greats, or even a definition of success, right? She gets into the question part here, where, well, if women really are equal to men, why have there never been any great women artists or composers or mathematicians or philosophers, or so few of the same? Why have there been no great women artists? This question tolls reproachfully in the background of most discussions of the so-called woman problem, but like so many other so-called questions involved in the feminist controversy, it falsifies the nature of the issue at the same time that it insidiously supplies its own answer. There have been no great women artists because women are incapable of greatness, right? So she's saying that the problem with this question in of itself is, what it really means is it's warped from the beginning, because the question is already like wrapping itself up in its own answer, which is that there haven't been any great women artists because women are not capable of that same level of greatness. And of course, that is problematic in so many ways. And so a lot of what our article is going to do is go on to prove why that is a false premise, because why there have not been great women artists in the same way that there have been white male artists is because of the social structures, professional opportunities, education, and really domestic expectations of women. And that our society and structure of society has shaped what women can be, what women could be. It's still, to this day, what women can be. And so that has actually played the role, rather than this kind of I'm going to ask this question that really is suggesting the answer that there aren't, right? It's already giving the premise that, well, there aren't any great women artists because they simply don't have the same talent, ability, and whatnot. Right. And then she says another attempt to answer the question involves shifting the ground slightly and asserting, as some contemporary feminists do, that there's a different kind of greatness for women's art than for men's, thereby postulating the existence of a distinctive and recognizable feminine style, different both in its formal and its expressive qualities, and based on the special character of women's situation and experience. So she's saying one way that people have tried to tackle this is to say, oh, well, that's just because there's a different type of the greatness in art has only been judged from the masculine side. And really you need to judge the greatness of art also from a feminine side. And then you'll see there's tons of great female artists and stuff like that. So that's her argument. Some try to argue that there's a different type of greatness for women based on femininity, right? Which has long been in history a thing. And she's going to go argue and say that's problematic in of itself, and that art, and here's where he gets to this restriction to certain types of art as feminine or masculine is a false dichotomy, and that it doesn't make sense that male artists have that were seen as the greats have also painted and produced artwork that would be classified under this feminine style of artwork, and women have done certain styles that would classify under masculine, and that it's super restrictive and creates all types of problems ultimately in this sense that art somehow is defined by gender as either masculine or feminine, and that is ultimately a problem and incorrect in itself. So and she's trying to say, right, of course, that in this attempt to change the question a little bit, it's not helpful. It's only problematic in itself, right? And then she does say, like, there has to be addressed that there are no women equivalents for Michelangelo or Rembrandt or Picasso or so on and so on. And just like there are any more than there are Black American equivalents for the same. And that's not because there is a lack of talent or ability, but it's, again, goes back to these structures that she's going to cover. So then she gets into that and says, in actuality, we all know things as they are and as they have been in art, as in hundreds of other areas. They're oppressive, discouraging to all those women among them who do not have the good fortune to be born white, preferably middle class, and above all male. The fault lies not in our stars or hormones or menstrual cycles or our empty internal spaces, but in our institutions and our education, right? That right here. Education understood to include everything that happens to us from the moment we enter this world of meaningful symbols, signs, and signals. The miracle is, in fact, that given the overwhelming against women or Blacks, that so many of both have managed to achieve so much sheer excellence in this male sphere. So she's saying, right, that it's not because of these other things that are being suggested, but rather it's because if you aren't born into this specific group, white, middle class, and male, it's not because women somehow lack some feature of great artists, or that Black men and women lack some feature of great artists, but in fact, from the beginning of birth through the whole society of education, both informal and formal, the societal institutions and educations have shaped this basically pressure to push against the women being able to become great artists. And so we should actually be impressed with the numbers of women and also Black men and women who have been able to push past those institutional and educational barriers to produce such amazing art, right? So that's the address it in that sense. She also mentions that part of the other issue is that men hold on to the power and advantages in society and with the art world. And that's not something that they're going to readily or easily or willingly give up, right? It is certainly not realistic to hope that a majority of men in the arts or in any other field will soon see the light and find it is in their own self-interest to grant complete equality to women, as some feminists optimistically assert, or to maintain that men themselves will soon realize that they are diminished by denying themselves access to traditionally feminine realms and emotional reactions, And I think this is even stronger here. Those who have privileges inevitably hold on to them and hold tight, no matter how marginal the advantage involved, until compelled to bow to superior power of one sort or another. And this is true. It doesn't matter who has the power or what. People who have privileges and power hold on to it. Even I thought this was important. No matter how marginal the advantage involved, right? So even if it is a small advantage, people are going to, when they have some kind of power advantage, are going to hold on to it. Thus, the question of women's equality in art, as in any other realm, devolves not upon the relative benevolence or ill will of individual men, nor the self-confidence or objectness of individual women, but rather on the very nature of our institutional structures themselves and the view of reality with which they impose on the human beings who are part of them. Most men, despite lip service to equality, are reluctant to give up this natural order of things in which their advantages are so great. For women, the case is further complicated by the fact that, as Mill astutely pointed out, unlike any other oppressed group or caste, men demand of them not only submission, and this is important here too, but unqualified affection as well. Thus, women are often weakened by the internalized demands of a male-dominated society itself, as well as the plethora of material goods and comforts. The middle-class woman has a great deal more to lose than her chains. So, right, that not only are women, held back like other oppressed groups, but then you also have that men demand not only of them submission, but unqualified affection as well. Right, this again, that goes to what we're going to talk to in a minute with the domestic sphere. The role of women and what they're supposed to do as a wife, as a mother. That is not just that you have unequal opportunities and limitations intentionally put into institutions by men, but then that society has also shaped the ideal role of women within the domestic realm, and there are obligations not only to their husbands to fall into that submission and role, especially in earlier periods in history. That has changed some since like the 20th century, but that this then is time consuming and sucks women's ability to have all of your focus, especially again in the earlier period in society. You couldn't devote all your time as a woman very often to just being a painter like men could. You had to also be a wife, a mother. You had other societal obligations of charity work or social events. And to dismiss these was to be ostracized, and or to be seen as unladylike. And that societal pressure for that domestic role is significant. Here we have the other part of this is this idea, this is challenging the whole idea of the greats in any way, in that those who have can be considered the greats have had these myths created around them, some based on some events that are true, and others that have been elaborated, expanded, and or outright made up to create this sense of genius, this idea of genius, that the people that are the greats because they have some inherent genius to them in this almost mythical realm that the average person couldn't possibly achieve, right? But that's all just part of a narrative that's been created around these greats, and reinforces this idea that their role or their status is unobtainable. Let's skip down to here. And then, so this is the societal components of it and stuff. She says, right, it's not that this genius is missing from women, or she had been talking about that actually the aristocratic families often didn't have, the great painters usually came from middle class or lower class as well as, of course, the other part being that usually the great artists came from families that were artists. So their fathers were usually artists. They had an advantage from the start of having access and exposure to artwork from birth. But the other part she says is that it's not that there's somehow this nugget of genius that's necessary is missing from women, or rather it is not that the kinds of demands and expectations placed before both aristocrats and women, the amount of time necessarily devoted to social functions, the very kind of activities demanded, simply made total devotion to the profession out of the question, indeed unthinkable, both for upper-class males and for women generally, rather than it's being a question of genius or talent. And I think that's a good point of showcasing it's not just women, right? That most great artists did not come from nobility, because noble families and their children had all of these other societal obligations which did not allow them to fully devote all their time. They could dabble in the arts. They could certainly, their family could pay for them to have it as a hobby, but you couldn't devote your whole time and profession to it and your whole life to it. Likewise, women also had all of these societal expectations that prevented them from wholeheartedly devoting their entire time to this as a career path. She also then talks about this access to education and opportunities, and how women had limited opportunities within education, and even when it goes not only to academies, but then more importantly to one of the key aspects in the earlier centuries, which was nudes and nude portraits and drawings. Women, based on the proprietary of what was appropriate, women weren't supposed to be exposed to male nudeness, and they certainly were often outright excluded from any kind of education that included nude drawings, which during the Renaissance was largely everything. And so if you're deprived of this key tool of learning that was seen at the time as the pinnacle of what was needed to be a great artist, you're obviously going to be limited in your development and what you can do. And certainly in the development of the female body, which again in the Renaissance was one of the key focuses and areas of painting and drawing, was the human form. And then that there was lack of professional opportunity. Women were not accepted as professional painters. In the middle of the century, there were only a third as many women as men artists. But even this mildly encouraging statistic is deceptive when we discover that out of this relatively meager number, none had attended that major stepping stone to artistic success. Only 7% have ever received any official commission or had held any official office, and these might include the most menial sort of work. Only 7% had ever received any Salon medals, and none had ever received the Legion of Honor. Deprived of encouragements, educational facilities, and rewards, it is almost incredible that a certain women did persevere and seek a profession in the arts. While art making traditionally has demanded the learning of specific techniques and skills in a certain sequence, in an institutional setting outside of the home, as well as becoming familiar with specific vocabulary of iconography and motifs, the same is by no means true for the poet or novelist. She's talking about here, this is why more women have been recognized and known as novelists, because they didn't have the same educational gatekeeping that the art world did. Right. Okay. And then societal expectations. This will be the last thing we leave on just for time. That this idea of into the 19th century, and I would argue even through the 1950s in the United States with a suburban housewife, there was this idea of a lady painter, where you could use this as a hobby, and it was great for busy work, self-indulgence, and a way to not be a bother, essentially. But that women were specifically warned not to try too hard to excel at any one thing, right? You should not devote all your time to being excellent in one type of skill, right? And this quote talks about that as essentially to be able to do a great many things tolerably well is of an infinitely more value to a woman than to be able to excel in any one. Right? This is what you should be seeking to achieve, is not mastery of a single subject, but rather general knowledge of several, specifically in this idea of that then you can entertain your guests and people successfully with it. And this idea of also that as far as painting specifically is concerned, Mrs. Ellis finds that it has one immediate advantage for the young lady over its rival branches of artistic activity, such as music. It is quiet and disturbs no one, right? So women were supposed to be quiet, seen but not heard, is kind of the statement behind that. Drawing is, of all other occupations, the one most calculated to keep the mind from brooding upon the self and to maintain that general cheerfulness which is part of a social and domestic duty. Right. She also says it can be laid down and resumed. So you can start and stop it too for all your other obligations. So again, if this is the structures that women have had to maneuver around within society throughout and the world throughout, the years, that this has influenced why there are not the greats in female artists in the same way that there are male great artists, right? It isn't because of lack of talent. It isn't because of lack of ability. It is that our entire system and structure throughout history has limited women's ability to have the same opportunities and options to do so. And the fact that there are so many women that we do know that are artists today, notwithstanding, of course, more into the 20th century where some of these things have changed, is amazing in of itself, because that means that these women persevered and pushed through all of these obstacles to still be seen as amazing artists, and that's kind of the point of the article. Okay, so that took a little more time than I was expecting, so sorry this will be a little bit longer lecture, but I think I wanted to make sure I went through that because it was a longer article and it had a lot of really good points, so I wanted to highlight several of those. So I'll try to get through this so it doesn't get too long, but let's look back then at traditional roles and impact, specifically women's roles in the domestic sphere and this kind of piggybacks on, I'm just kind of expanding on what actually was talked about in the article. Okay, so in terms of traditional roles of women, women have traditionally been marginalized to the domestic sphere throughout history. Specifically, of course, with the role as wife and mother. Women's roles were to get married, have and raise children. Their role was in the home, which was that domestic sphere, while men's roles were in the public sphere. It was very much defined as women were the domestic sphere and men were the public sphere, and that these were very clearly defined and separated. And this has impacted women's ability to work outside of the home, gain an education, and be seen as more than for the pleasure and benefit of men. Women have had to connect work outside of the home to the domestic sphere for it to be socially acceptable and accessible to men. So the idea being that every shift in society for like education, for work, women have had to justify why they should have access to that stuff, because it was very limited. You basically had to always say, here's the domestic sphere, and then how can we connect the education, or how can we connect a specific job to that domestic sphere? And if you couldn't do that for basically through the 1960s and 70s with the women's rights movement. Up until then, basically, if you wanted to to have it be acceptable in society and have access to this, it had to be connected back to the domestic sphere, where then it would be deemed acceptable for women to participate in that sense, right? If you didn't connect it to that, then it wasn't going to be seen as acceptable. Making work accessible and acceptable, that's like a tongue twister there for that, was this work that had to be put in to do that. So if this is the case, then right, one of the things, and this expands on what Nochlin was saying in her article, is that women are already coming from a disadvantage of being limited to, if not outright denied, access to these areas. And it's only through sheer will of force and time as women pushed over and over and over and over again to be included in more and more of these spheres. I mean, if you look at a timeline, like the United States, of expanding roles of women. And of course, with expanding roles of women means more options and opportunities for women, which is directly connected to opportunities for women in the artistic world as a profession and to be recognized. It was incremental steps, slowly pushing, and at the same time playing by the game of connecting it to the domestic sphere. So the example with this is with in early colonial societies and stuff like that, right? One of the first jobs, if we have the domestic sphere here, one of the first jobs that women could do outside of the home was to be a midwife. And the reason for this was a midwife took care of women and children, not men. Like, so, I mean, I guess there were, I'm sure in certain extreme circumstances, if there was no one else, that men were like, I'm dying, but no, I can't accept care. Although there are cases of that in history. So it's not like it doesn't happen. But so of course, in like certain circumstances, women midwives might step in and help an adult man. But traditionally, if it wasn't an emergency, and again, I know of specific cases in history where they basically said, no, I cannot be treated by you. And then they died. And, I mean, I guess that's the consequence of being limiting. But in normal day-to-day stuff, right, a midwife was there as a woman in the domestic sphere to take care of women and children, which is something they already did as wives and mothers, right? So are really just as mothers and women for women. So it was easy to connect the midwife to the domestic sphere. Midwife was there to help traditionally with childbirth, but also was essentially like a rural doctor in many ways. And midwives were usually passed on the knowledge and tradition from their mothers to their daughters. And so it was part of being in the family, and that knowledge and education was passed down that way. And so they served both as the role of doctor for women and children, and also as for childbirth specifically. But they weren't limited. Sometimes because of how we use the word midwife today, people think just childbirth, but it was for medicine as well, for when there were sicknesses. Then they often were called upon, especially because if you look at early colonial America, in many regions, there weren't male doctors available that you could call upon easily. Or in some cases that you just couldn't afford the doctor. And women midwives tended to deal with if they could pay, they could pay. Otherwise, they would trade in goods. So women, they also worked around this limiting factor for lower classes who couldn't afford a doctor. But women as midwives were often didn't refuse service to those, no matter what they could or could not pay, and would take goods and trade instead of that. So they played a super essential role within these communities that either didn't have doctors or couldn't afford doctors. Nonetheless, as more and more doctors moved into colonial America, midwives did get displaced by male doctors. And so then that role was somewhat taken away even though it was never discredited or seen as unacceptable, it was taken away as men filled that space. The next example of this is Republican motherhood. And this concept, Republican motherhood, came about at the end of the Revolutionary War, and was this idea with a new republic that was developing and taking place, that women now needed to take on the role of Republican motherhood. Traditionally, women taught their daughters housewifery. So there's this term, not just housewife, because that's somewhat limiting. Housewifery was a term of being basically industrious for anything in the domestic sphere. So, right, housewife tends to mean like staying in the home. A housewife is more of the tradition used like in the 1950s, suburban housewife. It's you stay in the home, you take care of the home. Housewifery, because in colonial society there weren't always stores, you had to make everything from scratch, right? That was about being industrious, building networks of women to trade for goods, working outside, doing what needed to be done. And that didn't mean going into jobs that were in the public sphere, but it certainly was more flexible and fluid than what the suburban housewife becomes in the 1950s, right? So women taught their daughters how to weave, how to sew, how to have a garden, how to cook, how to have a network of women to get things done, because you certainly couldn't do everything on your own. There was too much to do. You needed to have neighbors that you could trade with, because you couldn't make everything from scratch for every need that there was, right? Republican motherhood then said, okay, there's that, but we need women to now educate their sons and daughters, or their daughters and sons, in what Republican values, right? Republican motherhood was Republican values. And this doesn't mean like the Republican Party. Okay, so that's not what we're talking about here. Republican values of the new republic that had been created at the end of the Revolutionary War. So this included historical and political knowledge of the new republic. It also, of course, would be learning history, writing, classical literature, rhetoric, geography, and as well as the other feminine topics related to the domestic sphere in order to be a good wife. So you're still supposed to do all the stuff you used to do for your daughter, but now you were supposed to teach your sons and daughters what it meant to be a good citizen of the republic, of this new republic that had formed at the end of the Revolutionary War. Of course, the problem with this is that that leads to this, is that, well, in order for mothers to do this, to be a Republican mother, to have Republican motherhood, they actually have to be educated themselves. So the benefit of Republican motherhood is it actually opened up an opportunity for women to have education, where girls now went to public school and got educated in these areas, so that they in turn could raise and educate their children in Republican values. What this opened up in terms of a job was that women can now be, oops, that's not what I meant to do, teachers. So men had been the teachers in elementary schools up to this point. Now women took over the role of elementary school teacher. They still couldn't be college professors or higher education in any sense of the way, but in the general, primary education, women now could be teachers because it was connected to the domestic sphere through Republican motherhood, right? And then the same thing goes with nursing. Nursing was seen as a male profession during the Revolutionary War. In fact, women were called camp followers, who followed around because they couldn't afford to survive with their husbands gone to war. So they followed their husbands with themselves and their children to wherever the Continental Army went. And they became unofficial nurses in the sense that they would jump in and help out in caring for and changing, cleaning bandages, comforting men and stuff, but they weren't considered official nurses because that was a male's job. However, because of this work and the recognition that a lot of nursing was about caring for the injured and cleaning and sanitizing and comforting, by the Civil War, women now were nurses. That, in fact, so much so that that job stopped becoming seen as a job for men and exclusively for women. And it's only within the last 30 years max that men have started coming back into the nursing profession with any kind of numbers, because it so thoroughly became a female job. But again, it became acceptable because it got connected to the domestic sphere, because it was seen through the lens of the Revolutionary War, when women were unofficially doing it and realizing that, oh, this can be feminine traits and the part of that domestic realm. So the point of all this and how it connects to art and women and all of that is that this is what women are up against, right? Is that to do anything outside of the domestic sphere, it has to be justified as connected to it. And so that type, the education, the societal structure, other opportunities for making money, even what was called femme covert. This was when you got married, that basically your entire identity was now your husband's. So women were considered a femme sole if you were unmarried and no longer a minor. And femme covert once you got married, and it was your entire identity became your husband's. Any money you earned was your husband's. You didn't have a political identity outside of your husband's. That's the whole reason why they used to introduce people, not so much anymore, but when they got married, they're now introducing Mr. and Mrs. John Smith. Your name as a woman is erased, and your identity is now Mrs. John Smith, your husband's name. That was intentional. It wasn't just some default proper etiquette thing. It was an intentional recognition of women now identity being their husbands, right? And so if you couldn't earn your own money to keep, you could earn money, but it was technically your husband's, right? So you're fighting up against that in terms of professional occupations. Many jobs that even when it did get accepted, women couldn't do once they got married. So those societal or obligations also became limiting in that sense, because ultimately, what was Nochlin talked about dedicating all your time to a profession was seen as not what you did. You may do this profession for a while, but as soon as you get married, you stopped it. In fact, women were not allowed to be teachers once they got married. Women were not allowed to work as nurses or later in the factories and the little mills after they got married. Some women intentionally did not get married so they could keep working, right? But there was so much societal pressure on women to not do that, right? That how many female artists could make this their full-time profession, especially when you have then the pressures of society saying that women's roles are to dabble in all these areas and not be over obsessed about a specific role in that sense, right? And this connection to this domestic sphere, as I mentioned, continued until the 1960s and 70s. So it was huge in terms of that limitations. Now, one of the other areas and stuff where we see limitations for women in the arts is with the guild systems through masters and apprentices. In the 18th century, and actually a little bit before that as well, there was a whole guild system for the arts, but also like blacksmiths, carpenters. There was a whole slew of things that fell into this guild system, which essentially you had masters and apprentices. And the apprentices worked for the masters in very low-paying jobs or for free for many, many years. And often you were, as a young boy, you would go work for a master and you would live there with them and you would train for up to 10 years, if not longer, before you could be considered a master. And you had to be considered a master to have your own, keep clicking buttons here, shop or studio. Right? So if you wanted to have your own artistic studio as a woman, you weren't even allowed to be part of this guild system. Only men were accepted as masters. Only men were, most of the time, were accepted as apprentices because of the situation of how they often lived on site. And the whole system within the art world for this was, right, that the amount of time that it required for from a young age to become a master, to be considered even a potential to be one of the great artists, and to learn the skills you needed in art, was massively time consuming. And women couldn't do that and get married and have kids and follow the other obligations that they needed, notwithstanding that they just weren't even allowed within this realm to begin with, right? It was seen as inappropriate for unmarried women to live with men. So that alone excluded it. And then, of course, even if they were allowed to say you don't have to live here, the long apprenticeship was just impractical for married women with all of these other obligations. There are a select few number of female artists that we know about that were part of that system and that became known. Artemisia is probably one of the best known, but she was one of the early famous female artists. But she practiced at her father's studio. Her father was a master within this guild system. So she got to essentially informally be part of the guild system. Now we're going to look at and stuff some of the most well-known women in these periods where there was a gilded master. They were well known and famous because their fathers were masters and they could practice in the studio and work in there and be supported through that and not be expected to do something else. And then you have a couple women who actually opened up their own studios and systems for women specifically, because it was, again, if you didn't have a father or an uncle that was part of this guild, you weren't getting in. Right, so that when some of the well-known female artists opened up their own guild kind of studio systems for women, that was a huge deal that opened up avenues and opportunities for women that otherwise were just not there. Now, what ends up happening, of course, is that eventually the guild system ends, it's going to change. Women, though, it's not just because the guild system was there and excluded women, it didn't mean women weren't producing art. Women were creating art informally at home. Women were creating art in significant numbers. It just wasn't part of the established system that was going to get you recognized and known as a professional artist, right? Those professional routes were closed to women. But there was a shift in art academies when the guild systems did dissolve and end. But even with this, and while it did open up some opportunities for women outside of that, there was still limits to the art academies and schools initially allowing women in. And part of this was because of, again, the expectation of nudes and what was seen as appropriate at the time. And so that all had limitations. Nonetheless, there were still way more female artists in the 19th century than there had been in any other period. However, they still were treated as oddities rather than the norm, right? They were not. It was a huge jump. It's certainly from like the end of the guild system. It allowed for more women to become more part of the official system. Yet again, the majority of women there were plenty of women artists, but they were often creating at home because it was still difficult to get into these systems unless you had family and relatives that were part of that already. However, it is a good movement towards more and more women being professional artists when the guilds did end, because more and more academies did begin to slowly open up for women to participate in. And then in the 20th century, there's significant changes for women in terms of what was seen as acceptable, a kind of changing view in education. World War II had massive changes in expectations because women during the war were expected and encouraged to participate in the war industry. They created in the United States and actually in Britain and other areas of those that partook in the war, they created a whole set of propaganda to promote women being part of and central to the war industry, that because there was a desperate need for women to work in factories, and there was no connection to a munitions factory to the domestic sphere. So if you can't connect it to the domestic sphere, how do you connect it? Well, you connected as temporary and altruistic, right? This is a sacrifice for your country. Then don't worry, this is a temporary thing. But what it did is it got women into labor and work. And many women realized that they didn't want to, and not only the war industry, but in the United States, women were allowed to, for the first time in World War II, participate officially in the military under what was called WAC, Women's Army Corps, which was important because it recognized them as actual official military, which got them pensions. But this is where women were embedded as journalists and artists. This image, this painting here is from a female artist, Marion Greenwood, who was embedded as a journalist and sketched and painted many scenes from hospitals and the war front. And more women, this was an acceptable position, in part because of the opening of WAC, and that led to acceptance of embedded journalists and artists and other positions that women took within that. However, what happens is after the war, many women liked the freedom, the income, the opportunities that working in the war industry had given them, and they didn't want to give it up. And so there was kind of no going back. There was a huge push, and I know I'm sorry for the time and stuff. There was a huge whole propaganda and push system to try to reverse things back with the suburban housewife. But no matter how much they're going to push that through, there were still women who now, had that experience of working and wanted to continue it. This meant that what happened is that not only were professions more acceptable, so women could be artists as a profession and be seen as acceptable, just like other job opportunities, but also that art schools and education expanded significantly from like the 1900s through World War II. More and more women than ever were going to schools, to colleges to be educated. And this opened up the realm of art schools and academies for women significantly, which again opens up the realm to the professional world, to contacts, to connections, that allows for more and more women to be known as professional artists than ever before. The last thing I'll say with this is just looking into post-war changes and pushback. As I mentioned, one of the big ways was in the 1950s, the suburban housewife, because of this fear of women wanting to move into the professional realm and the fear of communism. There is a huge refocus on the nuclear family and getting back to traditional domestic sphere and roles. So much advertisements, media, television, magazines, artwork tried to, like this, reinforce what was called the ideal suburban housewife, that this is the role women should want to obtain. And it really was propaganda. It was massively pushed within the media in all forms, in art, in television, in film, in magazine articles, about how women should, that the ideal suburban housewife was someone who was married and had children and stayed in the home and cooked and cleaned and took care of the children and had everything prepared when the husband came home. There's the good, it's not Good Housekeeping, but there's an article that talks about, like, it's a list, and it was from an actual magazine at the time, of what women should do as an ideal suburban housewife. And it talks about how you should make sure before your husband comes home that you're dressed up nicely, with put some fresh makeup on, be happy and greet him, have a drink ready for him, listen to him complain, but don't complain yourself, because his worries are more important than yours. This whole idea of, like, women should be fulfilled and with cooking and cleaning, and in fact should be cooking and cleaning while well dressed and put together in high heels and a dress, and be fulfilled by that, right? But the reality is that women had now experienced stuff outside of that through education, through work, and were often not fulfilled and deeply unhappy with this. But there was a huge emphasis on all the new technology in the home, the appliances, the house, that this should be what you strive for. The biggest thing for women to strive for is not to work, not to be artists, but to be a suburban housewife. Now, this ultimately has a massive pushback, because right after the 1950s and the ideal suburban housewife is the women's rights movement, along with the civil rights movement. And this is going to lead, again, pushing back to this idea of, no, we want to do this. And all of this opens up, again, more and more opportunities for women to be professional artists, to have to be actually in the same sphere of education, to the point that today art schools, women make up 70% of enrollment in art schools, right? Now, again, we still talked about, and I mentioned, that doesn't equate to equality in terms of recognition, of pay, of opportunities, but it is a huge jump from not being allowed in at all to women now dominating the educational component, right? There's still room that needs to be worked on, because women are still marginalized as artists. They still are hindered by financial stability and recognition. If you can't get the financial stability and recognition, eventually you can't stay within that profession, because you have to make money to survive. Art galleries still often favor male artists, right, that is all still limiting, even with all of the advances and opportunities that take place, because of changes in society, of what's acceptable for women, no longer being tethered to the domestic sphere, even though it sometimes is still tried. And actually, more recently, there's been a huge push to tie women back to that. If you look in what's going on politically in the United States, and what proposals are being put in place, there is a massive push to put women back into the domestic sphere and limit them to that realm. And it's scary in the sense of, we have pushed so hard to move up into this, to celebrate female artists, to celebrate diversity, and not just white men or white women, but celebrate Black female artists, Asian American artists, Mexican American artists, and then around the world celebrating female artists, to have the same opportunities, to have more recognition, not only in the professional sphere, but name recognition, and also ideally financial recognition. And there is, and so, if you would have talked about this 5 years ago, we would have probably had on a more positive note that there's still a lot of work to be done, but here are the steps and improvements that have taken place in society, and we're still moving forward to where more and more women are now recognized and mentioned and seen as part of the, moving towards maybe the greats. But within the last couple of years, there's been, and it's only been increasing, there are legislation, policies, laws, rhetoric that is all targeting women, essentially to be that pushback to kind of like the 1950s suburban housewife, and in some cases even more limiting than that. And I think that, depending on how things go and what actually goes through, where we say we are today and recent efforts might be a whole different thing on, now women are no longer allowed to do this. Women have to be following within this. There's pressure and to stay within this sphere. So it's something to think about. And also one of the important reasons to pay attention to what's going on today, because it impacts where we will be as women, as well as what opportunities for female artists in the future, and actually really any profession at that. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry that this was a little bit longer than I had planned for it to be, but I did want to go over the article because it was long, and I wanted to make sure you had at least some key points and a good grasp that you could use for the assignment with that article. and it was directly related to what we're talking about here. So these are all kind of things that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be going back in time now, starting next week, and we're going to be looking at the 18th century briefly, and then we'll be moving on to the 19th century, and we're going to be talking about the various women artists in those centuries, as well as kind of some of the stuff I gave here of what's going on in society that's shaping women's roles, that's limiting or providing opportunities for women, how that's shaping the type of art, how women are portrayed in that art. So we're going to be looking at again, women artists, portrayal of women in art, both by women. So one of the other aspects of the assignment with the discussion board is looking at Judith slaying Holofernes and stuff. And there's 2 artworks, one done by a man, one done by a female artist. And how Judith and the other women in that artwork and the man is portrayed differently when it is a male artist that has done it versus a female artist. And that is an important part of artwork, and why it's so important to have women and diverse artists in the art world is that if you only have, white men as artists, there's going to be a very specific perspective on the subjects that art covers, and how women are portrayed, for example. You're only looking through one kind of lens and stuff. And how women are portrayed in artwork is often very different when women are the artists than when men are the artists. So that's what that aspect is going to be looking at. So we're going to be looking at all those kind of topics within the centuries, along with the specific artists that are known from that period. So I look forward to diving into that. I hope this piques your interest and you look forward to those topics as well. Have a great week.